What does the science show about the impacts of MBBP on health? We've talked about our ideas of how it works, how mindfulness training might help us basically just self-regulate better by enhancing our self-awareness and our ability to place our mind where we want to place it and help with our emotion regulation. Then we can take those skills and actually direct them towards our relationship with what we eat and how we move and how we react to stress, for example, or how we take our medication. But what does the science actually show? And so say if we think of the self-regulation side of things, here's one of our randomized controlled trials that followed people up over 6 months and found that those who went through the mindfulness-based blood pressure reduction program had a pretty nice increase in their self-awareness, much more than the control group that didn't receive the MBBP program. We've also shown some improvements in emotion regulation, like depression symptoms actually, and even some elements of attention control too. Probably a lot of you are wondering well, that's great and everything, but what are the effects on blood pressure? That's maybe why we're here. And so here's our randomized controlled trial effects on blood pressure, where we found pretty nice drop in systolic blood pressure, about 6 millimeters of mercury that held in this clinical trial to 6 months follow-up. And about a 5 millimeter drop in systolic blood pressure translates into about a 10% drop in major cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes. So it's a clinically relevant reduction. When we think about, say, some of the health behaviors that MBBP might influence, so for folks that didn't have a particularly great diet at the beginning of the study, we showed nice improvements in how folks adhered to what's called the DASH diet. That stands for the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It's one of the most evidence-based diets for bringing blood pressure down. It's a lot like the Mediterranean diet, but more Americanized and kind of lower salt. But it's fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes. They generally emphasize lower fat, whole grains, that kind of stuff. So nice improvements there, and also nice improvements in sedentary behavior. This is the amount of time that people spent sitting. So people just started moving more as they went through this program. That held, even got better, as the follow-up went along to 6 months. When we think about the long-term effects of blood pressure, this was our first study where we were actually able to follow people out through all the way to 2 years. And so, that blue line there is everybody that showed, significant reductions in systolic blood pressure all the way to 2 years. It stayed 6 millimeter drop in blood pressure. But if we looked at folks, that had the highest level of blood pressure, kind of uncontrolled hypertension, we really saw a pretty big drop in those participants that held long term. So it makes some sense. Sometimes those that have the higher levels of blood pressure just have more room to improve. And so we were able to see that with that study too. We even had a number of people get their brains scanned using this particular technique called diffusion tensor magnetic resonance imaging, and found that certain regions of the brain were affected. So the one region in the top there is called the left cingulum, and it's involved with emotion regulation, for example. And we found that basically the neural vessels there were became less leaky. And so when people have high levels of blood pressure, it can actually cause damage in the vasculature in the brain because there's just higher pressure in there. And so this showed some evidence of the damage actually lessening in that region of the brain. When we look in the right fornix, and that's the bottom one, that's an area that connects the hippocampus, which is an area of our memory, to the limbic system, which is an area of our emotion regulation and behavioral modifications. That also found almost more connectivity between kind of this idea of bringing our wisdom into the present moment that can influence our behaviors. So the wisdom or the knowledge might be in some areas in the hippocampus, the area of memory, that's then connecting in and increasing those connections to the areas that are involved with emotion regulation and behaviors. So these are some kind of cool mechanism findings that we've unveiled as well. So, just overall, the MBBP program has demonstrated some clinically relevant improvements in blood pressure and diet and physical activity in 2 different clinical trials now. But For me as a scientist, I know it's only 2 clinical trials, and I'd like to see more, including by other groups, and also to have more diversity in participants in our studies to go through it, whether they're from different regions of the world or different racial and ethnic backgrounds and other qualities. So we're actually in process, for example, working with some Native American tribal nations to develop a mindfulness-based blood pressure reduction program with them. We're also working on a grant with African American communities to create a mindfulness program really working to support their cardiovascular health. So in time, we'll get more and more evidence, and we'll continue to share that to help us really create as strong a program as we can that is as evidence-based as possible. So that's some of the science behind the MBBP program.